something that is very near and dear to me, and that is volume-targeted ventilation. And I guess my title slide kind of says it all. Volume versus pressure. It's more than just Coke versus Pepsi. What I'm going to do in this hour is to define the pulmonary injury sequence, at least as we understand it presently. Try to get you to understand that there are fundamental differences between pressure-targeted and volume-targeted breaths, and then we will review the clinical evidence. Now, this is, again, a site that's familiar to everybody in this room. It's a small premature baby with respiratory distress syndrome and respiratory failure who requires mechanical ventilation. And over the years, we've come to recognize that there are significant risks associated with both mechanical ventilation and, as you just heard, the use of supplemental oxygen therapy. And these include barotrauma, volutrauma, atelectotrauma, biotrauma, and rheotrauma, as I described it earlier. Now, let's look at the components of ventilator-induced lung injury. If this represents a model alveolus that is appropriately inflated, we can define volutrauma as the overdistension of this alveolus from excessive delivery of volume. And its converse is atelectotrauma, which occurs from the repetitive opening and closing of this alveolar unit, which is under-recruited and eventually will develop a loss of its membrane integrity. Now, is it volume or is it pressure that causes this irreversible injury? And there were a series of experiments that were done in the late 1980s and 1990s by investigators Hernandez and Dreyfus that I think sheds light on this information. And what they demonstrated was that severe acute lung injury occurred in small animals when they were when their lungs were inflated with large tidal volumes. But when they bound the chest cavity and the lungs were exposed to high pressure, the acute lung injury markers were much lower than the injury that ensued once the binding was removed. And therefore they concluded that it was excessive volume and not pressure which was primarily responsible for lung injury. And this is how they conducted the experiment. Here, they injected a very large tidal volume into this rabbit with his chest strapped by a cuirass device, which limited the amount of volume that could be injected into the animal, even if the peak inspiratory pressure was very high. But if you pushed in the exact same tidal volume without strapping the chest, it caused bilateral pneumothorax, even if the peak inspiratory pressure was not very high. Now, how do we factor this information into our current concept of the pulmonary injury sequence in the human neonate? And you've seen variations of this slide by several of the preceding speakers. So I'm going to look at this maybe just a little bit differently. Now, on this table, I have given you a very concise summary of the embryology of the lung. And as you all know, the lung goes through very recognizable steps in its development. And here are the various ages. We begin somewhere between 5 and 7 weeks when we transition from the embryonic to the glandular phase. At 16 to 17 weeks, the canalicular phase. And then finally, sometime around 24 to 26 weeks, septation and alveolarization takes place. And you'll notice that complete development of the lung really doesn't occur until we reach age 2 to 3 years. Now, if we define the period of viable premature birth, and we could argue whether it's 22 or 23 weeks, the point is that if we interrupt pregnancy during this period of prematurity, we are removing the baby from the womb at a time when lung development is far from complete. And what happens then for these babies is that they're born with inadequate lung function. And of course, this forces us to initiate chronic ventilation. And as you've heard throughout the day, there are many qualities of the premature lung which increases its susceptibility to lung injury induced by ventilation. Surfactant deficiency, well, we've done a pretty good job of taking care of that. But the babies still have premature antioxidant systems which render them susceptible to injury by free radicals. They have premature lung structure, and importantly, they have a very compliant chest wall. And oftentimes the chest wall is more compliant than the lung itself, again, increasing the work of breathing and forcing us to ventilate these babies mechanically. Now, all of these things can transpire to produce an entity that we recognize as ventilator-induced lung injury. But this isn't the end of the story, because there's another pathway, which you see here, and this includes number one, intrauterine cytokine exposure. Perhaps it was the chorioamnionitis and pneumocystis that caused the preterm delivery to start with. And many believe that this may initiate the inflammatory cascade that we then recognize later as bronchopulmonary dysplasia. We've heard a lot today about glucocorticoid treatment, both antenatally and postnatally, and although we talk mostly about the upside, the good benefits of steroids, we must also remember that steroids can be potent inhibitors of DNA synthesis. So the very steroids that we're giving to help promote lung development and lung function may in fact decrease the synthesis of new alveoli. Insufficient nutrition, again, we battle this every day in the neonatal intensive care unit. Babies are subjected postnatally to both lung and systemic infections, which have a role on injuring the lung. And as you just heard, oxygen toxicity itself may be a major contributor to lung injury. So when both the intrinsic and the extrinsic pathways combined, the net effect is an inhibition of alveolarization and the entity that we then recognize as chronic lung disease or bronchopulmonary dysplasia. So what I'm going to do, you've heard a lot about the extrinsic pathway. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we limit lung injury through control of tidal volume delivery. Ever since the 1990s, we've had the opportunity, at least depending on the equipment available to you, to make a decision about our target variable, whether we should pressure ventilate or whether we should volume ventilate. And I think, as you'll see, we're going to go through this historically. The data now clearly support one over the other. Now, let me begin with a little bit of a background here about the differences in the way that gas flow is delivered to a baby, depending upon whether you target volume or pressure. And I'm going to start on the right side with the pressure waveform. And what you see first here is the pressure waveform and the flow waveform. And with typical pressure-targeted ventilation, what you see is a rapidly accelerating, decelerating pattern of flow. So that when the breath begins, there's a rapid acceleration of flow, which peaks and then rapidly decelerates. And what this does is it creates a pressure waveform that looks like this. And what you'll notice is that peak pressure and peak volume, which again is the integral of the flow waveform, occurs very early in inspiration. And I like to think of this as what I call a front-end loaded breath, where you get maximum pressure and maximum volume at the beginning of the inflation. Now, from an intuitive standpoint, when would this be a good way to ventilate a baby? Well, it would be a good way to ventilate when, number one, you have a need for a high opening pressure, and number two, when you have uniform disease within the lung, homogeneous lung disease. As soon as your lung disease becomes heterogeneous, this becomes problematic. And it becomes problematic because gas flow takes the path of least resistance. So the areas of the lung that are compliant get overventilated because most of the gas, most of the volume goes there. The areas that are atelectatic continue to remain atelectatic. And so what we do with this is we accentuate the non-homogeneity of lung disease. And what happens with true volume-targeted ventilation is that gas flow is delivered as a square wave, where there is a slight acceleration at the onset, but flow is held constant throughout the inspiratory cycle until the exhalation valve opens. And what this causes is a ramping effect, so that pressure and volume build, reaching their peak at the end of inspiration. So this is a back-end loaded breath. And why this may be advantageous in a situation in which there is heterogeneous lung disease is that it's going to result in more uniform distribution of gas flow and volume within the lung, even in the face of heterogeneous lung activity. And we can look at this as another way. On the left side here will be pressure-targeted ventilation, and on the right side, volume-targeted ventilation. If this is our index breath, and here we have very poor compliance. Again, our compliance axis is sitting here at about 30 degrees. This is problematic with pressure ventilation, where, as I explained earlier, your tidal volume is going to be a function of lung compliance. And what happens when this baby is given a dose of surfactant and has a sudden improvement in lung compliance is that at the same pressure, we now deliver a significantly higher tidal volume. So unless you are actively at the bedside and watching every breath, the risk of over-distending and over-ventilating this baby is a lot higher with pressure-targeted ventilation. And I might add that the converse also occurs. So if you're ventilating here and the baby suddenly develops a pneumothorax, at the same pressure, you're going to be delivering much less tidal volume. What happens with volume-targeted ventilation? Well, again, if this is our index loop, here we are ventilating the baby, and suddenly we give surfactant and the baby's compliance changes. This is how the ventilator reacts. It says, well, the lung is a lot less stiff. I don't need to use as much pressure to deliver the same degree of tidal volume. And conversely, if you're ventilating here and the baby suddenly develops a pneumothorax, the ventilator says, I've got to crank up the pressure in order to deliver enough tidal volume to satisfy the situation. Now, those of you that are as old or nearly as old as I am may remember the first attempts at volume ventilation in the neonatal intensive care unit. And this happened in the mid-1970s with a device called the Bourne's LS-104. Interestingly, this was the first volume-targeted ventilator that was specifically designed for use in the neonatal intensive care unit. And this is what it looked like. And I can tell you that this particular model was sold in 1976. And the reason I can say that is typically the Borns company color-coded all of its equipment in dark green and light green. But in honor of the 200th anniversary of the American Revolution, they came out with a special bicentennial Borns that was in red, white, and blue, the colors of the American flag. Well, this device had a very polarizing effect on the neonatal community. People either loved it or they hated it. The people that loved it said, I can ventilate a baby much better with this device than I can the typical baby bird, the ventilator I showed you earlier. And those that hated it said, this device is uncontrollable, and every time we put a baby on it, they develop a pneumothorax or they die. And usually what happened is this device was kept in a storage cabinet, and the baby would not do well on the time cycle pressure limited baby bird ventilator, and somebody would say, you know, maybe we should try the Borns volume ventilator on this baby. And there would be a rush to the storage cabinet, and the nurse and the respiratory therapist would stand there trying to block the door from opening, and the neonatologist would say, no, we need to try this, we need to put the baby on the ventilator. And what would happen is the ventilator would get wheeled to the bedside, the baby would be switched from time-cycled, pressure-limited to volume-controlled ventilation. He would continue down that inexorable pathway of doom and would finally die. And the nurse would say, you see, that ventilator kills babies. And the neonatologist would say, I wished I'd used it sooner. Well, there were problems with this ventilator. It had a number of limitations. First of all, we had a real engineering problem with our ventilator circuits. The circuits back then were comprised of corrugated cardboard with a rubber coating, and they were very compliant. So you can imagine what would happen when the ventilator would deliver a volume of gas to a baby with severely non-compliant lungs. The chest wouldn't move at all, but the ventilator circuit would billow beautifully. So the baby really got very little of the desired tidal volume. The machine had a very slow response time, often resulting in dysynchrony. By today's standards, it had a very limited rate capability. But one of the really big problems we had was the difficulty in measuring small tidal volumes that these babies required. Well, the company was aware of this, so they provided us with a bedside computer to help determine the volume of gas. There. It says computer. Well, with all kidding aside, this was how we tried to calculate the compressible volume loss and try to subtract that from the actual delivered tidal volume to figure out the volumes that we were giving these babies. And I can tell you that it wasn't very accurate, and we probably did a lot of harm. It was incompatible with continuous flow. So what that meant was if the ventilator wasn't delivering a breath and the baby wanted to breathe, there was no source of fresh gas for the baby to take a breath. There was a high pressure bias, but I think this was an artifact in that most babies were not placed on this ventilator until they were already receiving very high pressures. And so people incorrectly assumed that there was barotrauma. But I think by far and away the biggest problem wasn't the ventilator, it was us. We had no idea what we were doing. And as an example, we assumed back then, incorrectly, that all babies had a tidal volume of 10 milliliters per kilogram, whether they were 500 grams or 5 kilos. So I think we inadvertently overventilated and overpressurized many of these babies simply because we had no understanding of lung function. So in 1982, the company decided to pull the machine off the market, and volume ventilation died its first death around that time. Well, what happened? What changed things? For those of you who think that this is abstract art, it's actually a microprocessor. It's okay, I didn't know what it was either. Once the microprocessor was installed into a mechanical ventilator, it changed everything. It enabled us to customize mechanical ventilation. And here's an example, and I'm not going to walk you through this very complicated diagram, but what I do want to point out is just this middle panel, and you can see that we now have the ability to independently manipulate the way we deliver pressure, the way we deliver flow, and importantly, the way volume is delivered to our small patients. The industry provided us finally with sophisticated transducers that enabled us to accurately measure small volumes, to provide very sensitive triggering, and more importantly, or most importantly, the sensor itself was very lightweight with very low dead space. And that's a real important thing for a small preterm baby. First of all, you don't want undue pressure on the endotracheal tube that might force the tube into a suboptimal position. And secondly, low dead space maintains low work of breathing. And finally, the ability to have real-time data displayed on a breath-to-breath basis on a screen enhances both monitoring and feedback and improves patient safety. And this was one of the first generation transducers. I just show it to you so again you can see how small it is. There were two ways of utilizing a transducer. One involves the use of a plethysmograph that estimates tidal volume by the deflection of a wire. And the other, the more commonly used method now, is the heated wire anemometer, in which there is a hot wire in the center of this. As gas flows over the hot wire, it's cooled, and the amount of current that is applied to bring the transducer up to its baseline temperature can then be converted into a flow and volume signal, or flow signal that is integrated into a volume signal. And a second wire enables us to do this in the opposite direction so that we can measure both inhaled and exhaled tidal volumes. And again, you've probably all seen these real-time data displays that allow us to look on a breath-to-breath basis at both pulmonary waveforms and pulmonary mechanics. Now, there is still a certain amount of confusion about what volume-targeted modalities really are. When I showed you the waveform before with the square flow, this is referred to as volume-targeted, volume-limited, or volume-controlled ventilation. And traditional volume ventilation involves using the square flow waveform. There are also hybrid modalities that target a range of tidal volume delivery. Many of you are probably familiar with volume guarantee, which is utilized on the Draeger devices, pressure-regulated volume control, or volume-assured pressure support. Now, all of these, again, have in common focusing on a tidal volume or a tidal volume range. But I will caution you that all three of these do not utilize the square flow waveform. They use the accelerating, decelerating waveform, so they're a little bit more like pressure targeted than they are volume targeted, but nevertheless are all under the heading of volume targeted modalities. And finally, I'm often asked, well, we don't have a volume device. Can we do this by just, closely monitoring the tidal volume delivery? And the answer is maybe, but I would guess that you're not quite as fast nor quite as accurate as the computer. And you should be doing that anyway, no matter what type of ventilator you're using. And this just shows you, again, the waveforms with assist control ventilation. Now, let's look at the evidence, and hopefully you'll come to the same conclusion that I have. If you go back to the literature, this is really the first randomized trial of volume-controlled versus time-cycled pressure-limited ventilation in a population of babies with RDS. And I take a lot of pride in this study. In about 1993, 1994, I brought the first volume-targeted ventilator to our sister unit in the United Kingdom. And I convinced them that we really ought to do a randomized controlled trial. And they said, why can't you do it in your unit? And I said, we've already lost equipoise. My colleagues are so convinced that it's a better way to conduct business that I don't think we can accurately complete a trial and get unbiased results. So my colleagues in the UK were more than happy to participate in this study. And it was a small single-center trial. We looked at preterm infants with RDS who weighed greater than 1,250 grams at birth, and there were 50 patients entered into this trial. Now, some of you are probably thinking, gee, these are fairly large babies, and maybe you weren't studying the right population. This was a technological limitation of the first generation volume ventilator, in which the minimum tidal volume leaving the ventilator was 20 milliliters. And even if the baby had horrible compliance, that meant that at least half of that, 10 mLs, would be going to the baby. So we really couldn't use a baby any smaller than this, or we would deliberately be overventilating them. And I'll come back to this in a minute. And what we found in this first trial was that we reduced the duration of ventilation. In other words, the babies are able to be extubated a lot sooner. And we had fewer complications, less pneumothorax, and interestingly, less BPD, and a surprise finding, much less severe neurologic injury, less IVH, less PVL. Now, I bring these results up because as we go through the history of the meta-analyses, you're going to see that these findings were replicated in virtually every meta-analysis that's been done over the next 25 years. This was the first review that was done by the group from Melbourne in 2005, and I won't belabor these until we get to the end, but this looked at the duration of intermittent positive pressure ventilation, and again shows a statistically significant reduction when babies were ventilated by volume rather than by pressure. This is the rate of pneumothorax. You can see again, statistically significant favoring of volume targeting. This was BPD, defined as an oxygen dependency at 36 weeks post-menstrual age, and it just narrowly missed being statistically significant. But we'll get there. And this, again, was another interesting finding. This was severe IVH grade 3 or grade 4. And again, the meta-analysis confirmed the finding that we did in our very first trial, published in 1997. Now, about this time, the company that we were working with made a modification in the amount of delivered tidal volume. They lowered it to a number that now enabled us to go back and repeat the study using a population of smaller and more immature babies. And the objective of this study was to assess the safety and efficacy of volume-controlled ventilation in very preterm infants with RDS. For this study, we used a little bit different outcome measure. And I think by this time we'd all learned that using extubation as an endpoint is very subjective. What do you do with a patient who self-extubates during the course of a clinical trial? Do you automatically re-intubate that baby because he hasn't met the study endpoint, even though he doesn't need the ventilator? And the endpoints tend to be somewhat subjective. So rather than using extubation, we said, okay, let's use a surrogate of disease resolution, and that is the ability to wean to a mean airway pressure of less than 8 and maintain it for 12 hours, or to have an alveolar arterial oxygen gradient of less than 100 torr for 12 hours. And these were equally applied to both groups. We looked at secondary outcome variables, which included the total duration of ventilation, where extubation was done at clinical preference, survival to discharge, and typical complications of both prematurity and ventilation. And importantly, we did an a priori stratification. In other words, we looked at babies above and below 1,000 grams separately. The protocol was the same for both groups. We used the VIP Gold infant pediatric ventilator using the assist control modality. We targeted an exhale tidal volume of 4 to 6 milliliters per kilogram in both groups. And for weaning, once they had reached predefined criteria, the babies were switched to a combination of SIMV and pressure support ventilation. All babies were treated with caffeine citrate, and they were extubated to nasal CPAP using the infant flow driver. And here are the demographics. Just very quickly, there were no differences in any of these variables among the two groups. And you'll notice that the use of antenatal steroids was almost 100%. There was one baby in the TCPL group whose mother did not get steroids. And here are the primary outcomes. This was the time to reaching the endpoint. In green is the volume control group. In orange is the pressure limited group. This difference for the entire group did not quite reach statistical significance, but clearly there's a trend here among the volume-controlled babies. But importantly, when we looked at the smallest babies in this study, those who were less than 1,000 grams, we see a decided advantage to volume-controlled ventilation with a highly statistically significant reduction in the time it took to reach the endpoint. We also looked at severity of disease going into the trial. And again, for the sicker babies, those who presented with an initial alveolar arterial oxygen gradient of greater than 100 torr, you can see again that volume ventilation proved advantageous with a statistically significant reduction to the endpoint. The other outcome measures are listed on this slide, and although this did not reach statistical significance, if you look at the mean or median time of ventilation, you can see a very significant difference between volume and pressure limited, and death before discharge. There were 3 babies in the volume group, 9 in the pressure group, and the p-value for this was 0.06. And I'll come back to this in a minute when I show you some longer-term data. Other complications were virtually the same. We didn't find a difference in this trial in chronic lung disease, but we think that a lot of this is the result of small sample sizes. Again, there are only 90 patients in the trial. Now, as part of this original trial, and I'm really appreciative of comments made by some of the other speakers, that we really need to look not just at what happens in the neonatal intensive care unit, but longer-term follow-up. So as part of this study, we designed a long-term follow-up for babies who were entered into the trial. And the aim of this was to compare one-year survivals, subsequent hospitalizations, pulmonary outcomes, and gross neurodevelopmental outcomes. And the way that we accomplished this was to use a structured questionnaire that had been previously validated from 2 surfactant trials published in 2007. And it involved a parental interview with the interviewer being masked to the allocated modality, as well as a follow-up of hospital records and assessments by the general pediatrician. And the main respiratory outcomes that we were interested in were, number 1, the frequency of reported coughing and wheezing, number 2, the use of pharmacologic agents to treat that, and number 3, hospital admissions, whether they were respiratory or other. Now this, all the credit for this slide goes to my good friend Win Tin, who is an absolute expert at follow-up ascertainment. And you can see here that of the total 109 babies recruited in this trial, 94 survived until discharge, 3 died after discharge, leaving 91 patients eligible for follow-up, and they managed to track down 93% of those babies. And that's a real credit to them. Now, overall, here are the mortality statistics at follow-up, and you can see that the trend that was established during the neonatal period continued to the 1-year follow-up, where mortality was only 11% in the volume group versus 22% in the pressure group. And if you look at the Kaplan-Meier plot, which you see here, the pressure group in green, the volume group in magenta, there is, again, this big difference. Again, it didn't reach statistical significance, but most of the separation, again, occurred during the neonatal period, but there were some additional deaths that took place in that first year of life, more in the pressure group than in the volume group. And here are the respiratory outcomes. The volume group in this column, pressure group in this one, and you can see that of those, that wheezing, the incidence of wheezing was statistically significantly higher in the pressure group, as was the need for pharmacologic medication through the use of a bronchodilator inhaler. And both of those were statistically significant, even in a small numbered series. So what we concluded after the completion of this second trial was that volume-controlled ventilation is both safe and efficacious in very low birth weight infants. The trend towards decreased chronic lung disease at 36 weeks had a clinical correlate at follow-up, and that a large study comparing clinically relevant outcomes appeared indicated. So, where are we? Obviously, in Kiev. This was the next meta-analysis. I don't know if this was ever published, but I got a very exciting email one day from Peter Davis, and he said, we've looked at further systematic reviews of volume ventilation, and what we found is, again, confirms your original observation of a reduction in the duration of ventilation, a reduction in the incidence of pneumothorax, and we're getting really close to statistically significant reductions in chronic lung disease. These were the whisker plots that he sent me. We'll go over those. Pneumothorax and chronic lung disease. This was several years later, again the same group, looking at volume-targeted versus pressure-limited ventilation, and they concluded in 2010 that infants ventilated using volume-targeted modes of ventilation had reduced death and BPD compared with infants ventilated using pressure-limited modes, and said further studies were needed to identify whether these modes improved neurodevelopmental outcomes and to compare and refine the strategies. And we move ahead. These were the results. Death or BPD. And finally, the most recent meta-analysis comes from Tang and colleagues, and this was published about 4 years ago. And you can see that the number of studies has gone up significantly since our very first study in 1997. Now, I will say at the outset that these are all a mixture of volume-targeted modalities. So some of these are volume guarantees, some are PRVC, some are volume controlled. Those have not yet been compared in any meaningful clinical trial, but they're all lumped together because, again, they focus on a delivered tidal volume. So where are we now? Well, mortality, incidence of BPD, now statistically significantly less when volume targeting is utilized. Duration of ventilation. Again, Tang concluded that volume-targeted ventilation reduced the incidence of BPD, the duration of mechanical ventilation, failure of the primarily assigned ventilatory mode, meaning more failures with pressure than with volume. It reduced grade 3 and grade 4 IVH, PVL, and air leaks compared to pressure-limited ventilation. 25 years after we found the same results in our very first study. And finally, the question is, why does volume seem to afford a real advantage compared to pressure? Now, these data, the next two slides I'm going to show you, came from our second trial, the one published in 2007. As part of that trial, one of the research fellows, Ravi Swami, did a really neat study in that he used a sophisticated software package to catalog every mechanical breath given to every baby who was entered into this study. The first thing that he looked at was median tidal volume delivery. And remember that we targeted an exhaled tidal volume of 4 to 6 milliliters per kilogram. And we were spot on with that. Whether you were in the pressure group or the volume group, the median tidal volume was about 5 milliliters per kilogram. Okay? So that doesn't explain the difference. But maybe this slide does. When we look at the variability of tidal volume delivery, we're very tightly, these are the interquartiles, they're very tightly controlled with volume-controlled ventilation. But with pressure-targeted ventilation, we're all over the board. So I think this may help explain some of the differences related to lung injury. This is actually from an adult study that was published by Callett and colleagues about 2005, where they did something in the adult population that we can't do in the preemies, and that is they actually measured the work of breathing. And what they found here was that it was the lowest for volume-controlled ventilation, much lower than pressure control, and even lower still from pressure-regulated volume control. Does it have relevance to the neonatal population? Maybe. So I'm going to conclude with a couple of comments. Number one is that volume targeting leads to a small but clinically important improvement in short-term pulmonary outcomes, including the incidence of chronic lung disease. The next step is for us to better understand and refine the techniques, as well as understanding the mechanisms, and to measure important outcomes in infancy. But I think the data at this point are very clear. We need to control the volume. Thank you.